I think it's urgent to have a book written from the left, and this is a socialist account on Palestine and on Palestinian resistance, because amidst all the denial and outright lies and the complicity of most of our media, we need to know much more about how we arrived at the horrors of Gaza. In particular, to grasp the intention of colonial and imperial powers in the Middle East, to understand why the Palestinian national movement has experienced both successes and failures, and the book looks at both, and to see that there is a way forward for the liberation of Palestine. The key purpose of the book is to put on record generations of resistance by Palestinians who remain, despite everything that Israel and its allies can throw at them, because they are still present in Palestine. We'll come to the question of their presence or absence. So despite everything Israel and its allies can throw at them, the Palestinians remain undefeated. The book centres on Palestinian resistance, but of course it places this in specific contexts. Most important is the emergence of Israel as a colonial settler state. And this state emerged from the era of British colonial control. If we could sum up the historic crisis of Palestinian society, I think we could say it's the Brits to blame. And some of the quotes that Jamila was giving you there are relevant to this issue, which I want to pursue. Of course, Britain today continues to play a role in the genocidal assault on Gaza. The British government is still to blame, providing Israel's rulers with arms and with immunity from criticism as the savage attacks go on relentlessly. Even now, the British government is contesting a case in the High Court that sets out how Britain's supply of parts for F-35 jets is integral to the assault on defenceless people in Gaza. So the British government is opposing that proposition. It seems to me that says everything about Starmer and the wider policies of the Labour government. The link with Britain and British history and Palestine, that link is live. Now, just across the road, here in Dorchester, opposite top of town, is the Keep, which most of you will be familiar with. The Keep was the headquarters of the Dorset Regiment. And in 1936, hundreds of troops of the British Regiment were put on transport ships and sailed through the Mediterranean to the Egyptian port of Alexandria. They were then moved over to a training camp at a place called Sidi Bushr. And after that, they were taken up into Palestine and stationed in Jerusalem. And their task was to join with the other tens of thousands of British troops to suppress the great Palestinian Intifada, which had begun in that year of 1936. The link is live, the colonial link is live all over the country. There are places like the Keep and what was the base beyond it, from which British troops went forth into the empire. My father was stationed in Palestine in 1943. And I have to say he wasn't there to visit the holy places. And then later on, during the war, he was in Helwan near Cairo in Egypt. He wasn't there by intention, I should say, to visit the pyramids. But he was there with all the others to guard Britain's interests in the Suez Canal and nearby Palestine. And I want to demonstrate, I hope I'll be able to demonstrate how the Gaza crisis of today was shaped in this colonial past. So, Israel emerged from the British Mandate regime that ruled Palestine for 3 decades after the First World War. Britain's strategists and politicians believed they had a vital interest in the Middle East. One of them, Lord Curzon, he said that the Allies of the First World War, in his words, had floated to victory upon a wave of oil. Palestine, after the First World War, was to be a base from which to secure oil interests and Britain's stake in Egypt and its control of the Suez Canal and the imperial routes to India. This was the logic of the people who made British policy. And of course, the British ruling class had 300 years of experience subjugating people who opposed colonial occupation. Just as in other British colonies, in the Americas, in Africa, Asia, Australia, the mass of Palestinians rejected British colonial control because the British had occupied Palestine in 1916. The Palestinians also rejected, of course, efforts by the Zionist settler movement to acquire land, to evict the Arab population, and to establish an exclusively Jewish state. But that was a project that the British endorsed because, in the words of Winston Churchill, I quote him, "We think a Jewish state will be good for the world, good for the Jews, and good for the British Empire." Now, British politicians were very strongly influenced, in fact, by anti-Semitism, by hatred and suspicion of Jewish people. Some leading British figures, like Arthur Balfour, who issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, were outright anti-Semites. But they were also calculating imperialists, and they believed that the Zionist settler project and the aim to establish an exclusively Jewish state in Palestine could serve British interests, especially because of the growing problem which the British faced in Palestine, the problem of rising Palestinian Arab resistance. Because, of course, the Palestinians, like people subjugated by colonial powers all over the world, were in resistance. In researching this book, I found new sources that document British military rule and its implications for the Palestinians, and equally important for Zionist leaders and later for leaders of the Israeli state. The British military historian Matthew Hughes has written a fascinating book. You'll find out more about it in the new book. He's a very interesting source because he's not hostile in any way to the British Armed Forces. He regards himself as an independent historian. He provides detailed accounts of British rule in Palestine in the 20s and 30s, and he describes the British military regime as militarised and brutalised. As Palestinian resistance intensified in the 1930s, the British mobilised all their experience of colonial repression, going back to the 17th century. You'll find their techniques familiar, rather in the way that Jamila described earlier. You'll find their techniques familiar because the British effectively tutored leaders of the Zionist movement, who increasingly learned from and participated in the repression of Palestinian resistance. Here's a flavour of British techniques used to suppress the Palestinians. Collective punishment, curfews, exile and banishment, demolitions, destruction of trees, crops and livestock, occupation of villages, arbitrary arrest, detention without trial, assassination, torture, concentration camps, covert operations, hit squads. And I'm afraid I have to go on. The use of collaborators, informers and human shields, controls on movement, attacks from the air and the sea, construction of walls and fortified emplacements, use of military law against civilians. And it's horrendously familiar. But we're talking here about the 20s and 30s. Key figures in the Zionist movement, I mean, for example, you'll have heard of Moshe Dayan, a historic figure in the process of Zionist settlement and in the State of Israel. Moshe Dayan participated in some of the most brutal British assaults because he was part of Zionist militias which were working alongside the British. And this is long before the Nakba of 1948. Dayan later became Israel's defense minister. Another of the key Zionist military figures, Yitzhak Sadeh, praised a guy called Ord Wingate. Some of you will have heard of him. He was a psychopathic British officer who led something called the Special Night Squads. He revelled in killing Palestinians. Sadeh described him as our leader because there was no difference for the Zionist militia between their aims and the aims of people like Wingate and his British hit squads. Britain armed and trained key components of the Zionist militias. This is something which we very rarely see referenced in any histories of Palestine. But I should add here, historians sympathetic to the Zionist cause confirm this relationship. Naomi Shepherd is a writer very, very sympathetic to the Zionist movement and the Israeli state. She comments that the Brits provided money, arms and training for the Palmach. The Palmach were the elite units which are to this day viewed as the core of the IDF. The Nakba of 1948, the mass displacement of Palestinians in 48, in fact, I'd argue, and I argue in the book, is unthinkable without years of closer and closer collaboration between Britain and the settler movement. So that Britain was the midwife. Colonial Britain was the midwife of the ethnocentric, exclusive state that emerged after the Nakba of 1948. Well, I said that a key theme of the book is Palestinian resistance. Mainstream Israeli histories, which again, as Jamila said, for decades accepted uncritically amongst Israel's allies, contend that in 1948 Palestinians walked away from their homes and lands, leaving the settler population free to occupy them. The proposition is absurd. The proposition's a falsehood, a lie, but also absurd. The Zionist movement had spent years creating militias, creating armed forces to confront continuous Palestinian opposition to the British and to the impacts of European settlement, to mass evictions, landlessness and poverty. So the book sets out in detail how in 1948 Palestinians maintained their resistance to ethnic cleansing in towns and villages across the country. Just as the Israeli state destroyed hundreds of Palestinian villages, wiping them from the map, it then attempted to destroy evidence of that earlier resistance. But the work of Palestinian researchers, and more recently of a group of Israeli academics, are often called Israel's new historians, and I include here the invaluable work of someone you probably know, Ilan Pappé, that this research has revealed that many Palestinian communities did all they could to resist the displacement and expulsion of 1948. In 1948, some key Zionist leaders, and these are the people who are becoming now the leaders of the new Israeli state, some key Zionist leaders wanted to disappear the Palestinians for good. In 1948, in the summer of 1948, the newly formed Israeli Foreign Ministry made a secret study of the 700,000 refugees created by the Nakba, the mass displacement. It argued, the Foreign Ministry, and I quote here from documents retrieved from Israeli archives, it argued the most adaptable and best Palestinian Arab survivors of the Nakba will manage by a process of natural selection, and the others will waste away. Some will die, but most will turn into human debris and social outcasts and probably join the poorest classes in the Arab countries. I think it takes your breath away. Some will die, but most will turn into human debris and social outcasts. We can see how in 1948 some of the Zionist leadership were so contemptuous of the Palestinians that they weren't viewed as human beings, and that ethnic cleansing would deal with them. They would, quotes, waste away. In case they did not, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, decreed in the summer of 1948, they may not return. Well, some leaders of the Zionist movement had long held just such ideas. In the 1920s, a key figure was Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Some of you will have heard of him. The founder of right-wing Zionism. He was an officer, or had been an officer, in the British Army's Jewish Brigade, and described Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims more generally, and I quote him, as a yelling rabble dressed up in gaudy, savage rags. Jabotinsky was the originator of the idea of the Iron Wall, what he called the Iron Wall, the militarization of Jewish communities in Palestine with the aim of confronting and defeating all expressions of resistance to colonization and settlement. A series of Israeli leaders has drawn directly on Jabotinsky's vision and strategy. They include Prime Ministers Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, and Benjamin Netanyahu. Today, Israel's most aggressive settler organisations stand firmly in this racist tradition. So when ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, you'll have seen them in the press with their very, very ugly statements about Gaza, when they call for mass expulsion in Gaza, they draw on a tradition going back almost 100 years. But where did these racist ideas come from? For the avoidance of doubt, and I think this is extremely important, particularly for those of us on the left, for all of us, but especially for those of us on the left, for the avoidance of doubt, these racist ideas have nothing to do with Jewish history and culture. Jewish activists have been among the most intransigent opponents of racism, of capitalism, colonialism, and imperial rule. This racist component of the Zionist project has been inherited from ideologies of the European nation state. It's contempt for people, subordinated by colonialism, the practices going back centuries of enslavement, the European colonial powers' contempt for people subordinated by their colonial rule, and their practices of mass displacement, of ethnic cleansing, of genocide, like that practiced by Britain in North America or Australia, by France in Algeria, by Germany in Southern Africa. So the new book addresses the issue of Israel's genocidal agenda and how more and more researchers have examined Israeli policy in Gaza and the West Bank, including some leading Jewish academics in the field of genocide studies, have referenced these colonial histories and concluded that what some call slow motion genocide has been underway for decades in relation to Palestine. The logic of the colonial settler state, the state that emplaces settlers among indigenous peoples, as the British and others did in North America, as the British did in relation to the Aboriginal population in Australia, and so on. The state that emplaces settlers among indigenous peoples leads inexorably to ethnic cleansing and mass displacement. And the more you think about the centuries of European colonial history, the more you see this being played out. So one of our friends in Australia, Michael Grewcock, puts it this way, I'll quote from him: settler colonialism, and this is of course what the Zionist project in Palestine has been about, settler colonialism is characterised by the forcible occupation of land, the displacement of indigenous populations, and the construction of a new society on terms defined entirely by the settler population. To succeed, settler colonialism requires foundational and ongoing structural violence to be inflicted upon indigenous peoples at an individual and communal level. What's infuriated the most aggressive wing of the Zionist movement is the effectiveness of Palestinian resistance to this project, going back 100 years. So the book looks in detail at three key periods of resistance. The Great Palestinian Uprising, 1936 to 1939. That's the period when our Dorset troops were sent to participate in the repression. The Intifada of 1987 to 1993. And the Intifada of 2000 to 2005. It's not to say that continued resistance wasn't taking place, but these are the high points of mass resistance. And they're not mere episodes. Each lasts years because it takes prolonged violent repression to suppress them. I mentioned earlier the cruel tactics used by Britain in the 1930s. I look at these in detail at the book. How the British recruited in the 1930s, actually first of all in the 20s, from the notorious black and tans, earlier used in Ireland. People will have heard of them, maybe, of the black and tans. They were an ugly bunch of people who operated in and around the British troops, using all sorts of violence against the Irish people. And the British employed them in Palestine in the gendarmerie established by Winston Churchill and later in the Palestine police. During the Great Uprising that began in 1936, when the Dorset Regiment was stationed near Jerusalem, over 3 years, the British arrested 528,000 people, 37% of the entire population of Palestine. And again, I had to read that statistic 2 or 3 times and confirm it. The more that you look at Palestine under the British mandate, the more that Israeli repression since 1948 echoes British repression. Israel, in fact, has a place in European colonial histories that go back 400 years. I'd suggest that today Netanyahu is the Zionist Oliver Cromwell, who suppressed Irish resistance to England in the 17th century. He's the Israeli Bugeaud, the French general who pursued genocidal policies in Algeria in the 1830s. He's the Israeli General von Trotha, the German general who supervised massacres in southwest Africa in 1904. They were all prepared to use savage attacks on the indigenous population to enable military occupation and the expansion of colonial settler states. Well, the book introduces an issue that's seldom addressed in relation to Palestine, the issue of class, of social class. It shows how the Great Uprising of 1936 to 1939 was led by the peasants, was led by Palestine's peasantry and by Palestinian workers. The movement was based on local committees formed in villages and towns, networks of activists, and you'd never come across this, of course, in Israeli histories or histories sympathetic to Israel, this type of of democratic organisation from below simply doesn't feature in the standard histories. But the movement was based upon local committees, networks of activists that were so resilient the British had enormous problems suppressing them, eventually bringing in tens of thousands of troops with the RAF attacking the most defiant villages from the air. The first armed resistance emerged among some of the poorest peasants in the villages of northern Palestine, and that's a pattern that's persisted over the decades. There's another feature of this early resistance that's highlighted in the book: the role of women, especially of peasant women, who were at the heart of the resistance, much to the consternation of the British, who struggled to understand and to control them. The movement of the 20s and 30s had to deal not only with the British, but also with a hostile local ruling class, the Palestinian landlords, who benefited from selling their properties to settler organisations, often evicting the victims of their own landlord greed. The book also shows, I hope, how after the Nakba, when a new organisation of resistance to Israel emerged in the form of the Palestine Liberation Organisation, the PLO, that its politics were shaped by leaders who came from a new social formation, the embryonic capitalist class that had emerged in the 50s and 60s as part of the oil economy of the Gulf states. Now, people of my vintage, there's a few in the room, will be familiar with the emergence of the PLO and the guerrilla fighters of the 1960s who renewed Palestinian resistance. They were drawn overwhelmingly, the guerrilla activists, from the impoverished mass of people in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. But their leaders came from elsewhere, came from the cities of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, where Palestinian business people were forging new careers as part of the great oil boom of that era. PLO leaders like Yasser Arafat maintained their loyalty to Arab capitalism, to the kings and emirs and sheikhs of the Gulf kingdoms and emirates. Yasser Arafat insisted that Palestinian struggle should never challenge those kings and other rulers and presidents of the Arab countries. It was a disastrous strategy that led the guerrilla movement to defeat and eventually paved the way to Arafat's historic concession to Israel and the US, to the formation of the Palestinian mini-state that's today's Palestinian Authority, a few fragments of land on the West Bank controlled by Israel and under constant attack from Israeli settlers and Israel's armed forces. But there's a much more positive aspect of class relations that emerges from Palestinian struggles. And this is the last thing I'd like to deal with in this introduction to the book. A much more positive aspect of class relations. The remarkable record of the Palestinian movement in stimulating solidarity in the Arab states, especially movements of working class resistance in states such as Egypt, Jordan and Algeria. So the book looks in detail at a very, very striking development: the relationship between Palestinian struggles against Israeli occupation and the rise of insurrectionary movements against the Arab regimes. There's been a recognition in Arab countries that Palestinians confront a state, Israel, that's at the heart of imperialist networks, protecting the West's interest in oil resources, its strategic interests, and of course the interest too of corrupt, self-serving Arab regimes. This is most clear in Egypt, where Palestinian struggles have pointed the way forward for Egyptians to challenge their own regime, also embedded in the imperialist system. This is a really profoundly important development. So in Egypt, there's been the repeated involvement. Now, just a word about Egypt. Egypt is the dominant economy with the greatest industrialisation and the biggest working class and a long tradition of workers' struggles which go back over a century, the most advanced in this sense in the Middle East. And there's been the repeated involvement of Egyptian workers in movements of solidarity and emulation of the Palestinians. British colonialism and the Israeli occupation fragmented and dispersed the Palestinian working class, with damaging consequences for the national movement. But the working class of the Arab states has not been atomised and marginalised. On the contrary, it's grown and become more potent. And when we think of the uprisings, the intifadas, the revolutions constantly occurring in the Arab states before 2011, during the so-called Arab Spring of 2011 and since, we need to know, I think, and I set this out clearly in the book, the relationship between these movements and Palestinian struggles. So the book traces a clear pattern, the connection between struggles against imperialism in Palestine and those in other states. In the case of Egypt, movements of solidarity with Palestine played a key role in stimulating and strengthening working class resistance that in 2011 became a revolution that deposed the dictator Hosni Mubarak and posed a challenge to rulers across the Middle East and posed an enormous challenge to the State of Israel. In 2011, mass strikes in Egypt, combined with the movements of the streets, removed Mubarak and his closest collaborators within days. And when you look at the Israeli sources, the Israeli media, the statements of Israeli politicians, the autobiographies of Israeli leaders and so on, you see that Israel's rulers shuddered in 2011. They fear the spread of revolutionary upheavals, the breakdown of imperial relations in the region, and above all, they feared the Egyptian people and their solidarity with the Palestinians. No wonder that in 2011, one American newspaper headlined, "Israel would rather have autocratic friends than democratic enemies." And if you recall, and again there's enough of us in the room to be able to recall this, the Egyptian revolution inspired movements worldwide. Remember the Occupy movement, which began inspired by events in Tahrir Square in Cairo, with thousands of encampments worldwide demanding justice for the 99% against the global 1%. The global 1% of exploiters and oppressors. Egypt's activists showed the potential of direct democracy, of the meaning of struggles for social justice. Okay, I'm nearly there. Just a few more quick points. There's much more in the book. It looks at the consequences of American and European obsession with the oil resources of the Middle East, inter-imperialist competition, and the implication for Israel and the Palestinians. It looks at the collapse of the so-called two-state solution and the need for a unitary state in Palestine. It looks at Palestinians' commitment to what in Arabic is called sumud, steadfastness or fortitude, and its role in the decades of resistance. It looks at genocide and its meaning in the case of Palestine. And of course, as I've said, at the growth of the global movement, well, not just in the Arab world, the global movement in solidarity with the Palestinians, in which, of course, we participate. And I just want to add a point here. When we go on great demonstrations, like the demonstration that took place 10 days or so ago in London with over 500,000 people present, and we make a lot of noise, and we express our anger, and we express our solidarity, it does not go unnoticed in the Arab world, and in particular in Palestine. And I'm really pleased to see a number of Thomas Hardy students in the room this evening. And you will remember how we twinned Thomas Hardy School with a school in Ramallah in the West Bank. And we had a number of fascinating Zoom discussions with them in which they described to us their lives under occupation, the effect of the occupation on their education and their communities and so on and so forth. And one of the young women, one of the very brilliant young women who spoke to us, said, please know that we see you. We see you especially on Al Jazeera. We see your flags and banners and placards, and we see your kufiyat, your Palestinian scarves, and we draw strength from your solidarity. So the emergence of the global movement in solidarity with the Palestinians, and particularly the BDS campaigns, boycott, divestment and sanctions, and our presence in the street, is of profound importance to the Palestinian struggle. Well, I'm going to leave the last words with Egyptian activists and young Palestinians. Last year, in Cairo, I was able to interview a group of Egyptian revolutionary socialists. One, who's been active on Palestine for 30 years, said this: Palestinian struggle is our struggle. It played a vital role in events that finally brought revolution here in Egypt in 2011. Events in Palestine, Israel's attacks and its attempts at genocide, and the bravery of our sisters and brothers in Gaza and the West Bank will again be part of our move to insurrection. He said, we learned much from our revolution in 2011, the successes and the failures. Next time we want to bring lasting change and to make Egypt a society that stands in solidarity with Palestine. No peace treaties, no deals with the murderer Netanyahu, no troops at the border with Gaza. We owe much to the Palestinians, he said, and will aim to match their courage and resolve. So, uprisings, intifadas, revolutions, they continue relentlessly across the Middle East. They have the power, we've seen it, they have the power to remove dictators and ruling classes complicit with Israel. And here, I believe, is the power to bring change and to advance the struggle for freedom in Palestine. Thanks.